During both World Wars, there was little doubt to many that the railways were one of the most important tools the nation could use against the enemy. Railways carried soldiers, freight and weapons to the front line, could take the injured home, and were instrumental in keeping the nation fed. The railways were so important that workers were excused from conscription and women were allowed to fill railway roles usually reserved for the men. One of the most important roles the railways undertook was in Operation Pied Piper. It didn't involve soldiers or arms. Instead, it involved getting the most vulnerable out of the way and into the countryside, and it was one of the largest movements of people the world had ever seen at the time. During the 1930s, military advancements meant that fighting was moving from the trenches and to the sea and the air. Planes on all sides were becoming more sophisticated and were being developed specifically for different roles for the upcoming war. Hawker Hurricanes lacked the large carpet bombing facilities but were small and agile and able to move quickly in dogfights. Large bombers like the Vickers Wellington could blanket entire cities with up to 5 tons in explosives. This meant for the closely packed cities and its residents, they would be an easy target. The threat was further compounded when the Germans bombed the Spanish city of Guernica in the late 30s. Led by air theorist Sir Hugh Trenchard, Sir John Anderson, head of the Anderson Committee, brought the 4 heads of the respective railway companies and several key bus companies together. Normally, the Big Four would not tend to deal with each other, but they agreed to help each other with a plan. Firstly, the country would be split into 3 zones. These would be evacuation zones, where evacuation was recommended. Neutral zones, where the threat of bombing was not as high, but there was still a risk. And reception zones, where evacuees can go with little to no threat of bombing from above. Anderson appointed local billeting officials to find homes for the displaced women, teachers and children, and would start the interview process to ensure that they have the means to take on extra people. Those unwilling to take evacuees would be threatened with a fine if they were found to have the means. In return for taking the evacuees, the government would pay the families for their services. The railways laid on extra trains for the task. They made sure that they would only use the major stations for pickups to ensure that the trains left full. Children were tagged and laden with a specific government-sanctioned list of belongings, as well as their gas masks. Once aboard, the children would be taken to their destination, where families would pick them up. There was no pre-selection process, which meant an agonizing time for many children. Over the span of 4 days, some 1.5 million children, vulnerable adults and teachers were moved. For many children, life in the countryside was a massive eye-opener. Many had not seen farm animals and had only assumed that basic groceries had come from shops or were man-made. The people taking on these children would mistake their lack of knowledge as parental neglect. Some children flourished in the new surroundings, while others despised it. It was mere pot luck who you'd be placed with, and the families would either be accommodating or downright abusive. Within the space of a few months, and little in the way of bombing raids, thousands of children would be brought back to the cities. The government stepped in again and advised a second wave of evacuations in 1940, adding that the fall of France would allow a straight corridor to the UK shores. The threats were so great that the government offered thousands of children to be shipped to Allied countries overseas, but a U-boat attack on an evacuation ship on the 17th of September soon stopped the plan. Parents once again rushed their children to the waiting trains, and the Big Four had to step in to help with the evacuations. This time, though, the threat of an air wave was warranted. London was hammered by the Blitz, using France as a corridor. For 57 nights, the bombs rained on the city. 7,736 children would perish in the Blitz, almost a sixth of the total lost. If the second wave of evacuation hadn't happened, this could have been so much higher. Meanwhile, in the countryside, teachers were trying to pick up the pieces from the wrecked education system. Many young teachers had gone to fight, and almost 1 in 5 schools were damaged. Evacuated children would cause classroom sizes to swell, and they had little in the way of books and supplies. Classes were forced to convene wherever they could, in basements, church halls, or even outside. By the time the war was over, the number of children who were unable to grasp basic reading and writing skills was at an unacceptable high. Some children evaded school altogether, with many preferring to learn life skills such as farming and cookery. It wasn't just children that was evacuated. Important and national treasures were smuggled out of cities to places of safety. Winston Churchill famously said, "Hide them in caves and cellars, but not one picture shall leave this island." The National Gallery had to make up a plan. You simply couldn't put masterpieces centuries old in a damp cellar, but keeping them in the city would be devastating. The Germans got their hands on them. Their value would be enormous, and their acquisition would go to pump the German war machine into further action. Experts scoured for a suitable hiding place, and they found one, not far from the Festiniog Railway in Wales. Manud Quarry had excavated the very heart of the nearby mountain, and the huge cavern would be perfect. It was remote, very easy to remain hidden, and the cavern was protected by hundreds of feet of slate and granite, so even if it was ever bombed, it was very unlikely to cause harm. The mission was top secret. Over 2,000 paintings and statues were safely packed away in special boxes and were transported in unmarked vans or Cadbury delivery trucks to avoid suspicion. The quarry had built a specially purposed narrow-gauge railway which carried the paintings through an airlock to 6 specifically built climate-controlled huts. These huts were designed to keep the paintings at the optimum humidity and temperature. The evacuation of these treasures was so important, workers even took up a part of a road just to get one of their 12-foot paintings under a bridge. Even today, the curb is noticeably larger at that point. Another set of artifacts evacuated was the crown jewels themselves. Even though they were under armed guard in the tower, it was felt that the tower was too conspicuous. King George requested that the most valuable gemstones be removed from their settings, and he took personal charge of them. Many people knew that they had been squirreled away at Windsor, but the king simply put the jewels in a simple biscuit tin and hid them in a hole under one of the many secret exits from the castle. When the war was over, the king gave the stones back and the jewellers put them back into their settings once again. When the announcement came that the war was over, the Big Four once again helped get the displaced moved home. For some, it was a great relief, but for others, it was heartbreaking to leave their foster families. Some unlucky children found they had no homes to go to, and some had lost either one or both their parents. There was a few that never returned, and some families even joined their children in the country, favouring that over the city. It would be many, many years after the war that the true toll on the evacuations had on the generations would be known. Many were emotionally scarred from having to be separated from their parents. It's only very recently that the real impact has come to light, and in the event of another war, it may be concluded that evacuation is not the best solution. The evacuations will always be ingrained into the history of the war. We've all seen the faces and pictures of the smiling children as the steam train pulls away, their mothers crying and waving goodbye from the platforms, knowing that for some, as their children enter the unknown, they may never see them again. It was the railway's greatest movement of people ever undertaken, and a feat worthy going down in history as one of the most pivotal moments in the war.